This is the first in the series of events that I'll be doing with QAI called Industry Briefs. And, what we want to do is focus. QAI sponsored a whole series of events over the last year about M-19-21 and records management, information governance in the federal government context. And this is kind of a follow-on to that. And what we wanted to do for this first one is focus on the immediate aftermath of COVID. We've all and sort of started to return to work, and we're, people are starting to go back. We're trying to think about what are the implications of everything that happened while we were in remote work, and what do we do about it? And so I put together this little panel that I think are, one of the things that's important is kind of think about who these folks are and what their degree of experience is. And so these are people, and you'll hear from them in a second talking about their background, are folks that I consider to be on the far end of the continuum of experience and maturity when it comes to records and content and everything that's involved in M-19-21. Not everybody's there, but we thought we would start with some people that I consider to be industry leaders and really understanding kind of what they're trying to do. That doesn't mean that they get everything right. That doesn't mean that everything is easy, but that's kind of the bias, if you will, of this first one. So I'm John Mancini. I'm with Content Results. I used to run AIM for about 100 years, and that's my background. And Dave, why don't you give your background, and we'll go through just quickly all the other speakers.
Good morning. I'm Dave Simmons. I'm with GSA, and I've spent many years working in records management, library management, and knowledge management. But I've gone through that whole digitization process, learning curve, and I'm glad to say I'm getting out at the back end of that and focusing more on other topics.
Great, Mark.
Hi, Mark Patrick here, currently serving as the Chief of the Information Management Division on the Joint Staff, which is the staff to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It's not the entire Department of Defense. It's a couple 3,000 folks that support him as the advisor to the Secretary of Defense and the President. I've been in this position since 2007, after 21 years in the Navy, where I did a bit of information management towards the tail end of my tour there. And we are responsible for the Joint Staff's records program, as well as overseeing the records programs of the Unified Combatant Commands, of which there are 11, SpaceCom being the newest, things like U.S. Central Command, UCOM, etc. So we oversee their programs around the world.
Hey, and Scott.
Scott Swiderski with Quality Associates, the only private sector fellow on the panel. But also have been in the information technology field for quite some time, really the last 2 decades, working very closely with a number of large federal agencies, specifically through this particular initiative. And John and I have spent a little time working, towards the success of what an outcome looks like for an agency. But I'm currently with Konica Minolta, who's now the owner of the Quality Associates organization, and I've been serving in that role for the last 4 years.
Great. So let's just hop right into it here. And this is what we're going to talk about today. We have 2 case studies. As I mentioned, you have Dave Simmons from GSA, who's going to talk about how GSA used the time during pandemic to constructive purpose. And then Mark's going to talk about information management during pandemic. And Scott's going to have some comments of experiences that he has had about organizations that have been effective in building a digitization strategy. We want to have some time at the end for questions. And then we'll have a key takeaway from each of the speakers at the end. So what I thought I would do is just reflect in a couple of slides to start with on, kind of this whole question of COVID, both, pre and I was going to say post, but given it's not quite post yet, at least we're on this side of the curve, if you will. So what I did is I went back and just had a couple data points that I wanted to extract as a little bit of context for us to think about today. The first is that went back to the RMSA, Records Management Self-Assessment, that NARA does. From 2019. And essentially, if you think about when that was really right before all of the COVID stuff started kind of manifesting itself. And so at the time, you see that, over 49% of those responding the agencies responding put themselves at high or medium readiness risk with regards to electronic records. And the reason that I put that up there is that, there's a tendency right now to, I think that everything was fine before COVID. There's always this pre-COVID, post-COVID thing. Everything was fine before pre-COVID. Pre-COVID, there was an awful lot of system challenge out there with regards to systematizing and automating the question of records management. Not having kind of nice training programs, but actually systemizing how you run these kinds of programs. And so that's where we were beforehand. Post, these are kind of some of the things that struck my eye. What I did here is I took a look through the SORM report, the Senior Agency Officials for Records Management, from this year. So that has a little bit of a post-COVID kind of slant to it. And so, as you would expect, and this is just my interpretation, I read through all the reports, and these 5 things really stuck out to me in terms of some of the issues that are out there. The first is, as you would expect, COVID really put a punctuation point on this question of remote work and what remote work is all about. It also highlighted the need for organizations to place much more emphasis on remote education, kind of a byproduct of that. Interestingly, a lot of mention of digital signature platforms, and I think that's important because what it says is that records and M-19-21 are part of an overall set of priorities that organizations have to transform themselves into digital government operations. And our speakers are going to talk about that, I think, during the context of their comments. There's a lot of challenges out there that people mentioned in terms of records ascension projects and their readiness and their capability to do that. And then also the postponing of a lot of digitization projects, but both those that were going offsite and ones that they normally would do on site, because obviously people weren't on site. And even for the offsite projects, there wasn't anybody that could transfer the stuff from onsite to offsite. So that was some of the things that really occurred to me as I went through those SORM reports from this year. The last data point is this is not one of the ones that you want to put in a press release because it's just the people on this call. You may recall when you're registered, I asked people, how significant is the paper problem in your agency? And the reason I ask that is because often that's a bellwether, I think, of the challenges that people have. And so what you can see here is 52%, still a very significant problem for them. We like to think that we're off in the stratosphere of doing all sorts of fabulous digital transformation stuff. But one thing to look at is when you have paper in those processes, driving out that paper needs to be an important part of the strategy moving forward. So without further ado, let me switch to my friend Dave. And Dave, take it away, and I'll run the slide deck and just let me know when you want to switch.
Okay. John brings up a lot of points from the RIMSA study that I'm probably going to build on. But when we were confronted with closing down the offices and forcing people to do remote work, GSA was a little further ahead, that we were doing remote work and had set up, work from home programs throughout GSA for a couple of years. And so we managed to move a little quicker, but there were some indicators that told us that we needed to be better at it. One of the first things that we dealt with was we were introducing a lot of new technologies for that remote work, and constantly my colleagues and I were brought into meetings, usually without a whole lot of notice. Back one, brought in with a whole lot of notice to talk about various topics and more about introducing the technologies and the new kinds of records that are created. And our basic message was, no, they're not new records, they're just different content, and they have to be managed like. And that's some of the things there. That snapshotting or treat like correspondence or treat like meeting minutes, so that it puts their mind to rest. We also did a lot of consulting with agencies that were looking at their content. In looking at our content, we were aware that the federal record centers were closed down, but we still had a chance to start planning on our boxes of records, our holdings, and our cleanup of those holdings currently in, specifically to identifying permanent records that are on their way to being sent to NARA and what kinds of things have a long-standing interest. GSA has a lot of assets like buildings and fleet of automobiles that have a pretty long tail in terms of their interest of what we work with and the records that surround the purchasing, management, and selling of those materials and those assets. So we wanted to make sure that we reduce the amount of temporary records as much as we could and right-size that. At the same time, we worked focused on upping our digital intake, and I'll be talking about that in a minute, but the new number as of this last week is now up to 25 million. So in a year and a half, we've pretty much moved from we've more than doubled our content, maintaining a classification of records in those document management systems at about 85 to 90%. That's what the darker blue of those cans are about. With each record, by doing what I mean by that is we put what I call toe tags or meta tags on every piece of content that's loaded into those document management systems, and those that helps us to classify and identify things that are eligible for destruction. So this is sort of the workflow of electronic documents. After we scan them, we put those toe tags on them, we load them into the EDMS. When we dispose of them on schedule, we maintain the shell with the information about the records management and dispose them of temporary records. So this is a work process, workflow for both intake, management, and retention of an audit trail for our destructions that does not happen in NARA after December of 2022, at least on the temporary records. Now, I spent many years converting paper and other analog formats into electronic documents, but the other thing that we're dealing with is also conforming born digital documents, which is one of the aspects of remote work that we're starting to see a lot of. And so that conforming is using sustainable standards of formats, identifying common meta tags that we want to use, both mission critical meta tags for search, as well as identifying what kind of records they are as they come in. So the general flow is, if we're doing conversions, it's a focus on conforming the intake into the EDMS. And then the thing that's the big mystery is, how do we declare and dispose? And we've worked out that process that I outlined earlier for temporary, and we're just starting to work on the permanent records. We're waiting on NARA for some guidance, more guidance on specific to meta tagging for digitized documents as permanent records. The discoveries we've made is with remote work, there's multiple copies, and we have to start driving towards identifying the official copy. As I mentioned, digitization is now not only analog, but also born digital. And we need to acceptable and sustainable formats as an agency identify those, and especially with permanent, making use of those listed out in NARA as sustainable formats. And then lastly, understanding that agencies are going to have to build some kind of process control for their records internally for disposals electronically, or transfers to NARA for e-discovery or for just tracking down and locating documents for people. And that's all I have.
So Dave, before I hand off to Mark, a question that occurred to me as you were speaking, particularly in the context of born digital. One of the things that I've found is that organizations have a big challenge with stuff that's born digital, but then it somehow becomes paper. And then it like often then winds up being rescanned again and then reborn digital. Have you had any success in figuring out how to keep things digital once they are digital?
Well, you brought up digital signatures. That's the common one, where a copy sent out to be signed, and somebody either signs it digitally or signs it physically and then has to rescan it and store it as such. Generally, what I say is two things. The creator is the owner of the document as the official location. And then secondly, the final document is the one that is signed. And it's not up to the signer necessarily to keep the copy, but the creator who has the more vested interest in maintaining that record. So that helps cut down on the multiple copies and the multiple versions and formats that are created in that process you outlined.
Yeah, because it just amuses me how many times documents are reborn in in digital form
yeah.
along the way.
The other thing that we've really worked hard at is identifying if something is converted from analog to digital format, the digital format is considered the record, not the paper.
Gotcha. Awesome. All right, let me switch gears and move over to a part where I'm sure there are no consequential issues that are dealt with at the Joint Staff, and very low risk, and nobody pays any attention to what the Joint Chiefs has to say about things, judging from the current news. A challenging place, and really glad to have Mark Patrick here to go through some of the issues that they faced.
Thanks, John, and thanks for putting a smile on my face at the beginning of my presentation. I appreciate that. So I'm going to take a slightly less tactical discussion. I want to talk about, just in a few slides, a couple of the things that were happening during COVID, and then I'll talk about things that we were doing anyway, and then kind of into a little bit bigger picture thought on this process. So we were already preparing because of M-19-21. We had a fair amount of paper records that we had on site that we normally, eventually got to NARA through a slower process through the Washington National Records Center. But one of the big differences probably between us and the GSA is the amount of classified information that we handle. So that affects some of the things that we do. And ultimately what we were going to do was expedite our movement of this paper to the Washington National Records Center so that we could get it in the system and, before the M-19-21 deadline. So that work was in progress as COVID began to wind up, and we pushed on with the preparation of that material to go to the Washington National Records Center. However, they couldn't take it because of COVID. So it sits, in a state of readiness to move. And that was kind of an impact, but our plans to do it, remain. It's just a matter of when it can be accepted. So one of the big items that happened in the Department of Defense, this is department-wide, not just the Joint Staff, was that the Defense Information Systems Agency launched a sort of quick version of Microsoft Teams to support work from home. And at the early phase of that, it was very quick by DoD standards when you're talking millions of users. The decision was made essentially that since this would be a temporary platform, that there wouldn't be a transition of this information directly to a follow-on version of Teams, which we were headed for already in a full-blown, M365 deployment. So it was declared early on that this was going to be a transitory system, and users would be responsible for moving data or information with a longer life cycle out of that system into other systems of record prior to sunset. So that, it was heavily socialized at the beginning, and we've gone through that sunset process and the movement to the follow-on in 365, what we're calling DoD 365. So that was how we handled that from a records and standpoint. Now, is the risk associated with that? Certainly, but this was a decision that was made to expedite the ability to telework. Recognizing that many parts of the Department of Defense had to continue to come in working, and we just went to a reduced or hybrid. So we started to be able to support working from home, at least with unclassified, and for some subset of folks, even with classified information. One of the fast things that occurred was that our predominant internal tasking system, our workflow tool for up to 10,000 actions a year that surfaced decision-making products for the senior leaderships of the Joint Staff, we immediately brought to life an unclassified version of that system, because in fact, a preponderance of the work that we were doing was unclassified anyway, but we were still doing it on the classified side. So we quickly brought that system online to allow telework to occur, and the record keeping for that was built into it. So but it's clear to me that we will not go back. As things change, if we get back to a condition where we're mostly back in the building, we're going to maintain systems in both places so that we will have to continue that work, and that's fine. Our transition to the M365 environment, I think, was expedited. It was also the skill sets that people were rapidly acquiring by using the temporary version of MS Teams increased the demand, and therefore, that process happened very rapidly, agilely. Ultimately, the DISA program managers started to bring in consultancy to ensure not only that we could safely, from a cybersecurity standpoint, do this and license it and figure out how everybody could collaborate, but also they brought in information governance consultancy to take advantage of what Microsoft is making available in the 365 environment. And that is ongoing. But I would say that it was probably expedited because of COVID, would have happened eventually anyway. But it also created a cultural change and expectations for the ability to use those tools. And we will be doing, more work as that environment continues to mature. Just to, emphasize again that the point was that we never went to full telework. It remained a kind of a hybrid situation with us. But those are some of the impacts that were COVID related that sort of were part of our journey that we're on. So really, what didn't change was that we were moving from the workflow tool and the records management application that we were using pre-COVID to an enterprise variant of that, which was driven by a couple of forces, but efficiency and the ability to move tasks between systems. We also, the overhead of managing this software internally to the joint staff is kind of onerous. So to be able to sort of get it in somewhat of a subscription basis was a priority even before COVID. So that continued, and actually the use of Teams facilitated some rapid agile meetings associated with that. As luck would have it, I was sort of PMing the movement to the new task management tool, and also the records management undercarriage of that. And so that was helped with MS Teams, and we've gone live with the task management application. We're in the process of getting ready to move our data and consume these services as managed services from a DoD provider now. The paper remains prepared to move when we can do that, and so that continues. What also didn't change is that we work for the government, and you can never do 100% of what you want to do when you want to do it. So you're constantly sort of having to make decisions about what comes first, prioritization of work. And I would say that I have some thoughts I want to close out strategically with on my next slide, and that is that how you manage that scarcity is driven by what's happening today, as well as what your organization is doing. What did change was the pace of some of the things that we were doing and the focus of various things. And as I mentioned previously, this culture change of an organization that had some things that were digital, but there were a lot of digital inefficiencies, things that were being done with more in email and things like that. The use of these tools, the movement of a task management system to the classified environment, the importance of being able to find things digitally wherever you were started to sort of seep into the culture, and I think that was kind of significant, and we will probably benefit from those cultural learning points as we move forward. So that's kind of a real fast scan of some of the big areas that change. But what we're still on is this journey, like COVID or no COVID, we're on this journey. And so it really comes down to, I think, recognizing that this journey is a part of a bigger picture that is supporting the requirements for the organization, their mission, and that there's a requirement for information records folks, knowledge folks, and data folks to work together as whatever is happening on the journey as we move forward. And I just want to draw attention to the fact that regardless of the M-19-21 activity that is absolutely necessary, it's not sufficient for this mission accomplishment. And it's really just a matter of mindset in my mind, that we're focusing the the priorities and the decisions that we make as we face that scarcity issue that's always going to be there, in asking ourselves what activity in our journey will best serve the interests of the knowledge workers and the folks who are supporting decision makers, so that if we have to prioritize, let's focus there so that we can show that mission bang for the buck activity, all the while working towards compliance as an enabler as opposed to a desired outcome, because mission success is the desired outcome. So that remained a focus, recognizing what's going on with data in the DoD community as well as knowledge management, and supporting that in a broader way. So we are the problem that you presented, John, about folks turning things into paper and back into digits. We definitely experienced that. And I just wanted to make a comment as I wrap up that, to me, that is a user experience for senior leaders problem, that as long as you make the digital piece of handling that information difficult for folks, if they have a staff, they're going to force them to turn it into paper for them, from my experience. And so if you can, so you're going to have a natural evolution of senior leadership being more and more comfortable with digital workflows and things, but you also have to couple it with, if you make poor choices that create poor user experience, then they're going to put the burden on the staff to give them paper because the electrons are too hard to handle. It could be they're traveling, whatever it may be. So just wrapping up, we are moving towards kind of more automation in our records management, which has an impact in our policies and the way we're evolving our disposition schedules, such that we can not have something that a human has to be involved in. So this is a continual part of the journey, and it will be collaborating with folks in other kind of records and information and data expertise areas will continue to be a part of what we're doing. So that's what I wanted to share, and I'm standing by to take questions. And,
great. Thank you, Mark. Now, that really, I wanted to underscore that point that you made about user experience and culture, and particularly when it comes to paper, but it also just relates to the systems in general, is that, that my experience has been, whether it's public sector, whether it's private sector, wherever you look at this, that when you run into problems, it's because you haven't addressed those two things. And if you have a culture that's driving paper, and if you have a really poor user experience that are driving people to turn stuff into paper, no matter what you say, it'll keep happening. And you have to address that on the front end. So thank you very much. So let's turn to Scott. And Scott, the microphone is yours.
Thanks, John. I wanted to touch on something. I see that we have a total of 73 folks that joined us today. And John mentioned earlier, as we opened up this session, that Quality Associates has been involved in taking on the initiative to really help educate and allow for both private sector and obviously public sector just to better understand the policy changes that have existed from NARA and OMB. And I go back and I look at one of those first sessions that we did, which was at the W Hotel face-to-face in December of 2019. And we didn't have COVID or the impact or the disruption of COVID on our mind at the time. And so a lot of what we were providing and preparing for folks really was around the policy. If you looked at our panelists at the time, most of the folks were coming from the policy side. And the reason for that was because we weren't at a point that we wanted to be, which was allowing agencies to begin describing their journey and the ability to comply with what these changes look like. We were hopeful that in 6 months' time, we were going to have progressive agencies getting there, moving very quickly, and ready to talk about the impacts of those things. And then sort of what coincided with the what we wanted to see was COVID. And so I'll talk a little bit about, obviously, a lot of the conversations that occur in our facility here, what people are reaching out to do and what questions they're asking. I think of the panel right now as Dave and Mark really being the what to the agency, and then somebody like myself being the how, right? So if an agency is going to consider outsourcing or inviting third party or private sector advice. That's where the direction of those sorts of things go is generally into us. So I wanted to touch on too something that Mark mentioned, which seems to be a pretty common theme with a lot of our conversations. I'd imagine that a lot of people's experience in trying to comply with this change that's being sought after by NARA was a bit more of a straight line. And you heard Mark talk about reprioritization, and he's used the word shift. And he's also talked about the impact of reprioritization and shifting. And we've had to kind of learn along the way what all that's going to look like, because it obviously has a lot to do with the timeline that these efforts can be achieved in. I know Dave has experienced a lot of similar disruption. He talked a lot about the remote worker and the reprioritization that's occurred just around his own conversion process and the tagging process. And who are these folks that were going to become available to do all this work? Because initially, we had thought that they might be in certain physical places where maybe the records existed, for example, and there was a plan behind how all that was going to get done. So I like what Mark had to say. The shift, the impact, and the reprioritization could probably be its own session, John, at some point about exactly how folks are trying to manage that. So shifting gears and becoming a little more relevant to my slide, I wanted to share 7 is just the top 7 of the type of considerations that are traditionally effective for building a digitization strategy today. They're not necessarily equally weighted, and I think 1 through 7 become something different for each of the agencies. John mentioned the word readiness, so we have lots of people that come to us with different readiness expectations, and it's kind of like preparing yourself for retirement. Some people kind of think they're already there when they're really not, and other folks are in great shape and maybe didn't realize it. So we help as an organization to help clarify their ability to be ready. But the first thing that we see that seems to be working, even with all this COVID disruption, is the developing of a knowledgeable working team. And so who are these folks that generally join the team? We've got folks from the records management side. Certainly IT is represented. There tends to be a leadership person involved in these committees. There's a business owner, if you will, of the documents themselves. And so it seems that the combination of all these folks seem to be making more of an impact for the success of an agency to deal with this change than not. And so that would certainly be one of the recommendations. This constant theme of assess and overassess, can't say enough about it. It's with all of us now having been as disrupted as we have been, even though you go to the expert or the subject matter expert within the agency, everybody has a little bit something different to say or talk about, even though we're talking about the same collection of permanent records. And so that's the assessment process, whether it's performed by a third party and or it's just a revisited effort by the agency to go in and really look at what's going on. This assessment holds up to be a source of information that's very valuable in the what I'll call next steps, right? Whether just the managing of the content and ultimately being able to deliver electronic content with proper metadata tagging to NARA. What are we dealing with? Is it an enterprise or a departmental type of project? I mentioned that not because it's relevant that the agency be unaware that they're responsible at the enterprise level, but what is the size and the scope of the project? Maybe that's just vernacular we use on our end. What are some of the business drivers for digitization strategy opportunities? Mark touched on the idea that paper records is just one part of this journey for most agencies. There are a lot of folks coming to us who are looking to take on the role of digitizing content, but more importantly, the role of modernizing their environment, right? And so process improvement, and I think Dave mentioned digital signature. There are a lot of different technologies being evaluated through the process of trying to comply with this policy change. What's the right approach? Well, there's a lot of them. Early on in December of 2019, we used our expertise to describe what we felt were a handful of the right approaches, but it seems today that there's a combination of a lot of things. COVID for a lot of agencies has prevented them, right, from being able to address this as the highest priority for that committee. Even that committee's been pulled around to do other things, like maybe address the stand-up of allowing remote workers to become effective to their organization. So the right approach today, I think, is something quite different than what the right approach was even a year ago or 2 years ago. So that again is kind of a whole nother session by itself. The engagement process. So what does it look like? Where do we start? A lot of people want to know is it a chronological thing? How can we be most efficient at going about this process to determine next steps? So engagement process, again, also part of what we try to uncover in the assessment. It's very important that we get it right because I think it really helps to establish how we're going to mitigate and manage any risk. How do you know when it's the right strategy for my agency? Well, again, kind of back to the assessment. Everything has a cost associated. Everything has a timeline associated with it. So those are kind of two of our key variables that we use as to what's right and what's wrong. And then we go back with the decision makers of the agency and try to make a determination of ultimately what are they trying to get done, right? And so mapping back their expectations with the expectations of a plan ultimately lead us back to what that right strategy is going to look like. So real quickly, what do we generally focus on and the how about and the how these conversations come about? Volume, time, and space. If we're really trying to tackle what seems to be a part of most of these initiatives and projects, there is a big digital conversion lift. A lot of times, Dave talked about it, Mark talked about it. This is an area that is generally in concern by most of the folks that we're talking about. What does it look like? I just put this in there as kind of a visual prop, really. So, a lot of folks that are doing our assessment work are using forms like this that are ultimately materializing into dashboards. And so we've got, information being gathered, and then we've got report outs that are made available through the gathering of this information. And so the point of this slide is to just really give you an idea that there's no easy way necessarily to go about the gathering of the information unless it's being made available by the agencies. So once it has been gathered, there are all ways for us, obviously, to automate the solution telling, right? So the comment around what does the right solution look like is ultimately drawn out of the information that we've gathered through the assessment. And so this is my last slide. The question comes up quite frequently. The agency is ultimately trying to make a determination on what this timeline might look like, and whether they're doing all this in-house or they're choosing to outsource it, or it's a hybrid of approaches. They generally want to know from us what that workflow process looks like. And we could substitute the word workflow for a plan, right? Just very simply, what is the plan going to look like? This is where the higher ups seem to want to endorse the folks like myself that are in the field and on the ground and doing the work. They want to know, what does closure look like, right? And so there is a compliance factor to all this. So a timeline is very relevant, which is why we lay these things out in the type of model that you're seeing on screen now. So, initiation, planning, production, reporting, and closure. These are the 5 key categories that we've come up with that help us to define what that plan's intended to look like, and then report up as to, how we're measuring against each one of these categories. I don't have the time to go into each one of the boxes, but if you'll, kind of quickly take a read on what some of those areas are, these are what makes these topics so relevant for us in the way that we go about our process.
Thank you very much. We've got some good questions here, and Mark and Dave, why don't you unmute yourselves so that we're all online here. The one that was floating around in the chat, and I direct people to the chat, there's some really interesting information in there. Was talking about this question of when the doors will be open on the federal record centers. Did you guys want, I noticed you guys commented on that in the chat. Do you just want to highlight that, both that question and then also what your sense is of that timeline?
Well, right now, I know that NARA has waived the destruction of temporary records fees associated with that. So it's a good time to focus on that. I should have probably said that in my earlier presentation. But if you go to the NARA's website, there is under the Federal Record Centers a schedule of which ones are open and what level of services, whether they're allowing transfer services or reference only services, those kinds of details. And it varies from FRC to FRC, at least last time I looked, of the 17 Federal Record Centers.
Great, thank you. It'd also be helpful as people look at the chat, if there are issues that you would like to explore in future webinars, just stick them in there in the chat, and we'll pick that up after the event and make sure that we cover it. There's a question here related to digital signatures, and should the digital signatures be the original validated digital signatures in all record copies, or can they be flattened? In other words, printed to PDF. Do you guys have a sense of that?
I would just say that early on, when I talked to NARA some years ago about digital signatures, they basically said, if you recognize it as valid, then we do. So there's probably a lot of flexibility in that.
Agreed. One of the things that I'm aware of is once you load it into a document management system, you've got a certain level of integrity on that document layered on top of that digital signature. So if you had a flattened file there, you also have integrity on the document based on where it's stored. And that's the kind of the philosophy we've been taking, of thinking of the document management system as a vault, the Chubb safe that you load documents into.
And then looking at some of these questions here in the question section, one is just a mechanical one. Slides available for downloading. Yes. Copy of the recording. Yes. Question here related to mobile records during the pandemic in terms of how and whether to capture that stuff and incorporate it into inventories. Any perspectives on that?
I would start off with the suggestion that there are technologies obviously available to capture from a mobile perspective. A lot of these mobile plans and mobile devices have been for years considered part of the records management solution. And so, it wasn't just COVID that sent people working, from remote locations. And so in a lot of cases, that kind of technology has existed. And therefore, those records that are being captured with mobile technologies have for years also been considered part of their permanent, record collection. So I would say yes is the short answer. And I don't think that COVID, while it obviously brought more people to the consideration of mobile capture has really been around for quite some time.
Years ago, GSA had a philosophy of anywhere, anytime, any information was accessible. And what that led to was a lot of centralizing of our electronic information systems and making that accessible in the home through VPNs or other infrastructure. So we maintain a lot of stuff centrally rather than trying to leverage mobile technologies to bring this stuff to the office.
That, for the purposes of security, as well as what Dave talked about, any devices that are used, whether it's a personal device or a government furnished equipment type device, generally speaking, the device is dumb, no data stored on it. You're interacting with a cloud server that's the same server that you're interacting with when you're sitting at your desk in the building. So mobile to me is like, you just mean records. Data is data. It's all being, managed in the same place, whether you're accessing it from a home personal device via a VPN or a piece of government furnished equipment.
Yeah.
Understanding that this is that your responses are unofficial, and understanding also that you don't have to answer. But there is a question, if you want to be a professional handicapper, about whether the M-19-21 deadlines will be moved at some point. Anybody want to posit it, or you want to just duck that one?
Well, John, you may want to mention, we are involved in the bridge session. So for those that aren't aware, the bridge is the voice of NARA out to those that participate from the agency side, with very few private sector, I think, involvement. So we have not heard that, and from I think the highest levels of NARA that the timeline is intended to change. I know there has been a lot of conversation around exceptions and exception handling of the timeline, but nothing has come from NARA to date that has suggested a change in the timeline. So that's my unofficial answer, because I don't want to get in trouble with any folks from NARA that are participating on this call. But maybe if others pile on, I won't be the only guy that chose to answer the question.
I would redirect that to your appraisal archivist.
Well, I'd redirect to my account manager. But I think that I'll bolster Scott's point on that. I think that one of the things that we need to make use of the state internally within our agency as a leverage for challenging people to think about how they manage information. And it gives us a little bit of a stick. I don't want to lead with that, but it gives us a reason why we're getting into the rooms and the meeting spaces that we need to discuss the design of information, the proper meta tagging at the time of conversion, and then also how we stage stuff out to NARA for disposition properly. And I think that deadline, while it stands, gives us some kind of a platform for that capability.
And John, Dave, you mentioned earlier the use of business rules for generating meta tags. And I just saw this question now, kind of backtracking a little bit to it. Do you recall how many business rules you needed in order to accomplish that task?
Oh, I knew you were going to get to me. Somebody's going to come up with RPA on this. One of the things that we did prior to where I'm at in this stage was we redid all of our disposition schedules, and with an eye to identifying the business rules and stages, we did a lot of conforming the different disposition rules to those stages. But more particular to your talk, John, or your question, is we have the work processes in place, but we're dealing with many different collections of information. We're either digitizing or conforming that's born digital. And so each set of rules usually has a different flavor to it.
Before we move to wrapping up, I wanted to ask you, Mark, you and I have talked about this a number of times offline, but talk a little bit about some of your thoughts about how the role of records managers and records officers needs to change in terms of having a seat at the table and what it takes to have a seat at the table and kind of those kinds of issues, because I think that's an important part of the culture that needs to change if we're going to be successful here.
So I've talked a lot about this with my records officer and lots of other folks. It's just really a mindset change. I don't want to in any way be condescending to records professionals that you are a critical part of your organization's operational mission. But ultimately, I've thought about this through a marketing lens, and even NARA expects you to have a marketing plan for your records program. But I would just say the marketing experts are not in the federal government. There are marketing professionals out there that I've studied through my interactions with folks via AIM and just my own reading that I've done, and essentially come to the grips with the fact that you have to treat every engagement with elements of your organization as a RIM professional as a strategic opportunity to show the value that you bring to the mission with your information management skill set. So that means a couple of things. One, you need to understand this marketing at play. I looked at a couple of books, seen lots of speakers, and I throw out there, gap selling and the challenger sale as a couple of good reads to get your head around this concept, because you need to essentially, it's a journey of selling your skill set as critical to the organization. At some point, you're going to start getting invited to the meeting at the beginning of the crisis. They have connected the dots between, wow, our information and data is critically important, to where are my information and data management professionals at the beginning of the crisis? And let's ensure that we can find this, not for the decision I'm making this afternoon, but when Congress or FOIA comes in 2 years, that it's the audit trail is tight and everything is there. So it's a mindset change, I think, that's a subtle one. And again, I don't want to be condescending because RIM folks tend to understand their importance. It's a matter of upskilling themselves on the what the knowledge professionals in the organization's pain points are, their information pain points, and seeking to address those first as opposed to compliance things. Because I can tell you, that the chairman, I'll get in trouble if we don't comply with the statutes for information management. But if the chairman doesn't get the information that he needs at the time that he needs it, to the degree of authority and whatnot that needs, that's going to affect him, and it's actually going to affect the lives of service members. So it is a mindset thing. It's a do what you do, but the way that you market yourself is come to the table as a helper and become that recognized information technical expert. And so there's just a lot of you have to sort of think through that, what that means locally. But there's a certain amount of attitudinal change and sort of personal upskilling in marketing and your organization's mission that you'll have to wrap in with your information management skill sets that you already possess, so that you can be a natural fit at the table when your organization is doing things.
Awesome. So I'd like to ask each of you guys, let's start with you, Scott, for one key takeaway you want to make sure that the audience leaves with.
We didn't prepare for that question, John. I don't have an answer for that yet. I'm just kidding.
Then we'll pass right over you then.
No, you saw what some of the questions are that have come around, and people are looking for a little forgiveness in the timeline. I think it's best to operate assuming there is no change in the timeline. I think it's fair to say that a lot of these projects, as we're now reporting out, on the case studies and the value of these conversations from Dave and from Mark and from all the other agencies we've given a platform to share their journey of becoming, what we'll call compliant, but kind of back to some of what Mark was talking about, this reprioritization and this shifting and the impact that it's having. I think it's fair to say that if you're dialing yourself into the information that's available, that's out there, this can be a little bit of a challenging task, and the shifting that's going on and the reconsideration of how to make this a straight line and not a dotted line effort is there. But I think that there's a lot of lessons learned. I think there's good information in the marketplace right now to help any agency, consider what some of these best practices would look like. So my takeaway would be, go find it, right? Go make the effort and start to take a look at what's being published out there, because there is information way beyond just the description of the policies about the how. And I think that's what this session's all about, is an opportunity to learn more about the how.
Great. Dave, how about you?
Well, one of the paradigms that I've seen shifting as a key takeaway is that we always talk about the information life cycle, and that's more of a stream when we're talking about digitization and ultimately either disposing of the document or transferring it to NARA. And that I'm going to challenge RIM workers as a key takeaway to think about what that means in terms of the creation of information, so we're less reactive to the information once it's completed, and how we provide or make accessible during that product's or that piece of information's life cycle, and how we dispose of it properly. We tend to focus on the tail end of that aspect, but now as we get into COVID and the creation of information and meta tagging, we're moving ourselves upstream. I'm not sure if my fingers are going up to the right or to the left, but we're moving upstream to the creation cycle, and we're invited to the table and take advantage of those things, those opportunities to be at the table during the design and access phases of this information.
And Mark?
I think it is a very exciting time to be in this field in the federal government or any agency. And I think that what I'm talking about, there was a question in the Q&A section about marketing yourself. I am figuring this out on my own. I don't feel like this is an area that there was something I reached for off the shelf that was immediately there. Through my involvement with a professional association like AIM, through collegial relationships with other records officers throughout the federal government, and just diving into my organization's mission, which all you have to do is flip on the television and watch the news in my case. But I don't have a pat answer, but I definitely think that evolving yourself as a records and information professional, you should be collaborating broadly with other folks who touch data, who touch knowledge management, whatever it may be, the IT people. You should be engaged with a lot of other technical experts in this broader body. And if you're not, then you need to be in meetings where you are uncomfortable, because you're not the smartest person around. You're smart about your piece of the puzzle. But so to me, it's going beyond classical records and information management to see your critical role that you play, and then going after that. And it, there's just no one size fits all. That's why I threw out a couple of marketing books, and that germinated from years of sort of thinking about this over time. But I definitely think continuing to evolve yourself and your collaborative efforts across the information and data community are key to move this forward. So that no solution providers, talk to them, have them in your circle, and know other records professionals at other agency in the private sector, and just continue to grow and think on your feet, because there just isn't one set of quick answers for how to move this thing forward. But I can guarantee you that information and data will continue to be critical to your organization's mission. And so watch that technology change, watch it evolve, and evolve yourself so that you can be, arm in arm with a lot of other people to support your organization's mission.
And I think that's a good closing point. And just last comment about it. This might be fodder for some future event that we put together, maybe in this series, maybe separate from this series. I don't know, but it's a passion that I've had as well, Mark, about this question of the discipline is so critical right now, and yet it is also so under siege right now, because the pace of technology change is making this so complicated. And so, but I think it's an issue that really needs to be addressed. It's a space that I have some passion for, about the importance of positioning this function within organizations and helping elevate. Because if we don't figure this out, 25 years from now, nobody's going to have any idea what the hell we were doing back then. I mean, as a history major, that will be lost, and it will be gone forever, because all that will exist is chaos. So, but thank everybody. Thank you, panelists, for being here. Scott and Mark and Dave, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for the folks that attended this, and we'll be teeing up another one of these in another month or so. And so make sure that you let us know any topics that you'd like covered. And thanks a bunch, guys. Really appreciate it. Thanks.